This week we're going to focus on Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is about the evolution and diversity among the microbes. So we'll be talking about microbes in general, and we'll be talking specifically about microbes in the domain bacteria, archaea. We'll also talk about protists, which are in the domain eukarya, and we'll talk about viruses, which aren't categorized in any of the domains of life. The sections we'll be focusing on is 1 through 3, 5 through 6, and 9 through 17. Here's your learning objectives. You should know that microbes are in all three domains. Know that the domain bacteria is probably the most diverse of all organisms, and be able to describe how in humans those bacteria have harmful or beneficial health effects. You should know that archaea exploit some of the most extreme habitats. You should be able to describe protists and the different types of them in the domain eukarya. And then you should be able to talk about how viruses are not really classified as living, and they're kind of at the border of living and non-living. There are microbes in all three domains, so you will find microbes in bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Microbes are the most abundant organisms on Earth, and the word microbe is a combination of Greek words that translates to small life. So microbes are any organisms that we can't see with the naked eye, essentially. They're very small and they're very diverse. It's hard to make generalizations about microbes since they are so diverse. They are just grouped together simply because they're small, not really because they share a recent common ancestor. This is showing you that diversity. In fact, microbes occur in all three domains of life. All the bacteria are going to be microbes. All the archaea domain are going to be microbes. And then within eukarya, there are microbes in the protist kingdom. Also, you have viruses, which aren't included in any of the domains of life because they aren't technically alive, which we'll talk about in the last sections. Most microbes are tiny. The tiniest things are going to be viruses. They're much smaller than a single cell. They're only 100 nanometers wide. So a nanometer is a millionth. Oh, it's a billionth of a meter. It's a billionth of a meter. So an influenza virus is about 1,000 billion trillion times smaller than a human. And then if we look at the single-celled organisms of bacteria and archaea, those are about 1,000 million billion times smaller than a human. So much smaller than a human, but not even as small as a virus. So if we look at relative sizes and we say an influenza virus, for analogy's sake, is the size of a pinhead, then a cyanobacterium, a single-cell bacterium, would be the size of a tennis ball. So even relative to a single-cell, viruses are very small. Take-home message is that microbes are grouped together only because they're small, not because of evolutionary relatedness. They occur in all three domains of life, and viruses are not categorized in any of those domains. Just because microbes are simple doesn't mean they're not successful. They're very well adapted to a huge variety of environments. In fact, one of the environments that they thrive in, especially bacteria, are our own bodies. More than 400 species of microbes are thriving in your intestinal tract right now. So on the left, you can see some E. coli in an intestine. Also, 500 or more species call your mouth home, and nearly 200 species live on your skin. So right now, all of that's happening on and in your body. And that's because living conditions in the human body are fairly moderate. We have a pretty normal, good normal temperature. We have a good normal diet. We have a lot of water in us. So it's a pretty easygoing environment for bacteria to live. Other microbes like archaea inhabit some of the toughest environments on Earth, though. You can find them in the almost boiling water of hot springs. You can find them a mile below the Earth's surface, and more than a mile deep in the oceans where hydrothermal vents emit water at 750 degrees Fahrenheit. Microbes are abundant. You can find lots of them everywhere. Before I talk about how abundant they are with us, I'll give you an example from seawater. So if we took a milliliter of water from the surface of the sea, A milliliter is way less than an ounce. I think it's about 50 milliliters are in 1 ounce. So 1/50th of an ounce, you would find in that tiny bit of water 100,000 bacterial cells. You would also find some microbes in the category of protists called diatoms, and there would be about 100,000 of those as well. So you'd have 100,000 bacteria and 100,000 single-celled eukarya in that tiny milliliter of seawater. And then your own body is a testament to the abundance of microbes. It contains about 100 trillion cells, your whole body. That's the approximate number of cells that you contain right now. But only 1/10 of those cells are actually human cells. 90 trillion or 90% of the total cells in your body are microbial cells. So you are a minority in your own body. Go ahead and answer this question. Use the figure on the right and pause the video if you need to. And the answer is number 2. Alright, so microbes can live almost anywhere, and there's millions of different kinds. Remember how we said microbes are in all the domains of life? Now we're going to focus in on the first domain of life, the oldest, which is bacteria. Bacteria may be the most diverse of all organisms. How we classify them is by their shape. There are spherical cells, rod-shaped cells, and spiral-shaped cells. And that's shown here in this image, all 3 of them. Obviously, microbes are invisible to the naked eye, so we can't always see these individual cells unless we're using light microscope technology, which is fairly recent. So what we also do is we look at their colony shape. So bacterial cells reproduce by binary fission, which is an asexual reproduction, kind of like mitosis essentially. And they can reproduce in like 20 minutes in the case of E. coli. So in a few hours, a single cell can form a colony containing thousands and thousands of cells that are a clone of that original cell. And we used to have to use that before, we could rely on light microscopy to look at them at the individual cell basis. And we still use that today in labs as identifying what type of bacteria it is we're working with. Bacteria are the simplest organism you can imagine. Remember that bacteria are prokaryotes. So the 3 domains of life are bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Eukarya are all eukaryotes, meaning they have a true nucleus and they have membrane-bound organelles. And then bacteria and archaea, the other 2 domains, are both comprised solely of prokaryotes. Prokaryotes have a plasma membrane. In most cases, bacteria have a cell wall. Inside of that plasma membrane, we're going to see the cytoplasm, which is a kind of fluid that fills all kinds of cells. We've talked about all of this before in previous chapters. There's, of course, proteins in the cytoplasm carrying out essential functions like digesting molecules of food, transferring the energy gained to ATP, etc. There's circles of DNA in the cytoplasm. They're just floating around. They're not chromosomes. They're circles of DNA. And the DNA carries the instructions for making all the proteins in the cell, much like our DNA does. They also have ribosomes. Ribosomes are not organelles because they're not membrane bound, and the ribosome is the location where all those proteins are going to be manufactured. So know the characteristics of a bacterial cell. Essentially, it's a prokaryote, if you remember those characteristics. And then a single bacterial cell can grow into a colony of cells. One important feature that makes bacterial diversity possible is that bacteria can metabolize almost anything. We group bacteria into categories based on these metabolisms. All 3 are shown here. On the left, we have chemoorganotrophs. So troph means feed. So these are organisms that feed on organic molecules such as carbohydrates. You can find these as pink, sort of scum looking stuff on your shower walls or inside your shower curtain. Chemolithotrophs. Litho means rock, troph means feeding, so this translates as rock feeders. They have the opposite metabolism of chemoorganotrophs because chemolithotrophs eat inorganic molecules. So an inorganic molecule does not contain carbon. It could be eating ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen, or even iron. The element iron is a metal. If you see any sort of like green stuff pop up, like rust almost on iron, that's from chemolithotrophs breaking down that iron. The last category is photoautotrophs. Photo should be familiar to you because it means light. It's from the word photosynthesis, also has it in it. And this translates to light self-feeders. So photoautotrophs undergo photosynthesis. It's a modified photosynthesis though because they don't have chloroplasts. Remember, bacteria are prokaryotes, and prokaryotes don't have organelles, and chloroplasts, as we learned way back when, are organelles. They have membranes around them. But photoautotrophs do have some chlorophyll. That's the stuff inside of the chloroplast that harvests the energy from the sun. And photoautotrophs can use light energy to convert carbon dioxide to glucose, much like how plants do. An important group of bacteria in the photoautotroph category are called cyanobacteria. Definitely know about them. And the cyanobacteria that live now closely resemble the first photosynthetic organisms that would have appeared on Earth about 2.6 billion years ago. And that was a really important date because it was the start of a major global change. Up until that time, the Earth's atmosphere contained no free oxygen. Instead, the air consisted almost entirely of nitrogen and carbon dioxide. Remember how plants during photosynthesis, they take in carbon dioxide and then their output is going to be oxygen. So before we had these photosynthetic, at least you should say photoautotrophic bacteria running around, the cyanobacteria, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere 2.6 billion years ago. Cyanobacteria are the first organisms that could use solar energy to build organic compounds like glucose from the carbon dioxide and in the process break down water molecules to release free oxygen. The accumulation of oxygen released by cyanobacteria is called the oxygen revolution. Oxygen, which humans depend on now, makes up about 21% of the volume of air. And cyanobacteria still release important quantities of oxygen into the atmosphere. Go ahead and answer this question. Pause the video if you need to. The answer is number 2. Number 1 and 3 are wrong because it's carbon dioxide and nitrogen. That was what the atmosphere is made of 2.6 billion years ago. Number 4 is wrong because it wasn't until recent times that 21% of the Earth's atmosphere was oxygen. There was no free oxygen 2.6 billion years ago. So number 2 is the correct answer. Alright, so know that the different sorts of metabolisms of bacteria, and know that 2.6 billion years ago we had these cyanobacteria, which are photoautotrophs, show up and they put oxygen into the atmosphere for the first time. When we think of bacteria, we tend to think of them as something bad or nasty, but there's lots of good bacteria in addition to some bad bacteria on our planet. Here's some examples of good and bad bacteria. Certain bacteria help to regulate your gut. It helps to modulate your immune system. It can also help you get vitamins from food. E. coli can be bad, but all of us have E. coli in our gut, so the normal populations of E. coli are not bad at all. So there's several types that inhabit the gut, and they're involved in the production of vitamin K2, which is essential for blood clotting. And if your natural population of E. coli are happy, then when some sort of bad strain of E. coli bacteria comes in, that natural population, that natural flora, will help keep it in check from taking over your gut. Lactobacilli provide produce vitamins and nutrients, and they can even protect against carcinogens. And of course, there's bad ones as well that are associated with human disease. A lot of times we get these from contaminated food. So there's types of E. coli and other bacteria that in contaminated food, if we get those in our system, are bad, but the ones that should normally be there aren't bad at all. They're very good for us. So do you like yogurt? You can thank bacteria for yogurt. Lactobacillus acidophilus and several other species of bacteria are added to milk to create yogurt. So you know that yogurt's a milk product, but did you know how it becomes yogurt-like? So as the bacterial cells use the milk sugar for energy, the byproduct is lactic acid. That lactic acid reacts with the milk proteins to produce the characteristic taste and texture of yogurt. If you buy a brand of yogurt that is labeled as containing live cultures, you are consuming live bacteria cells as you eat the yogurt, which is actually really good for you because those are things that can go on into your digestive tract and help you digest all sorts of things that you need. So that's actually good live bacteria. When people consume those live cultures on purpose to try and make their gut happier and more regulated, that's called a probiotic therapy. Alright, so normally your body is full of good bacteria, but a disease-causing bacterium can colonize your body and then it can make you sick. If the population of harmless bacteria is dense enough, it will prevent invading bacteria from gaining a foothold. So you want those bacteria there to help keep the bad ones out even. They're kind of like sentinels. But of course, there are bacteria that cause human diseases. We have to talk about those too. They're not all harmless, helpful bacteria. We call these ones that cause diseases pathogenic. Pathogenic translates to disease-causing. But I want to point out that the number of pathogenic bacteria is tiny compared to the total number of species of bacteria. Some bacteria are always pathogenic, like cholera, plague, and tuberculosis diseases are caused by always pathogenic bacteria, but there are other bacteria that are opportunistic. That means that they're not always bad for you. Opportunistic pathogenic bacteria are responsible for acne, strep throat, scarlet fever, and the flesh-eating necrotizing fasciitis, if you've ever heard of that. Opportunistic bacteria are normally living on you. It's when something changes that they can turn bad. There's always Streptococcus pyogenes in your mouth and throat, but it's not always going to be causing you strep throat per se. Other disease-causing microbes would be responsible for sexually transmitted diseases. I heard a recent report on NPR last week, I think. The CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control, the CDC of the United States put out its report for its findings for the 2015 year. And again, St. Louis made the list. So St. Louis is the 2015 STD capital of the nation for both chlamydia and gonorrhea. So you have about 15,000 cases of chlamydia and 5,250 cases of gonorrhea. Also, those numbers are up from 2014. So that's unfortunate, and I know the majority of those cases are in individuals under the age of 25. And I read an interesting article about like condom deserts. Just like how there's certain areas where there's not a lot of thriving businesses or grocery stores, there's also areas where it's very hard to go and find condoms and things to prevent these STDs that should be pretty preventable. So that's not helping the situation in St. Louis either. And why are they sexually transmitted diseases? Like, what does that mean? Well, to many microbes, the human genitals and reproductive tract represent a desirable place to find shelter, nourishment, and opportunities for reproducing and dispersing. So they really like those environments. Those are happy environments for them to live in. Unfortunately, those microbes can cause problems for humans in the form of sexually transmitted diseases or STDs. STDs produce symptoms of varying severity from mild to extreme discomfort. They could cause sterility or even death. Depends on which STD. It's estimated that more than 300 million new cases of STDs occur each year worldwide. Of course, a huge one is HIV, right? So here's some examples of sexually transmitted diseases. STDs are caused by all types of microbes, bacteria, viruses, fungi, protists, even by some arthropods, which are like tiny lice. The organisms are passed from the mucous membrane of the genitals. They could also be transmitted by needles for drug injections, but that wouldn't be sexual transmission. That would be directly blood transmission. Good news, most STDs are easily curable with antibiotics. Sadly, when I talked about St. Louis being the 2015 STD capital for chlamydia and gonorrhea, they also said in that report that these are easily preventable and curable, sometimes with just one dose of antibiotics. So if people were able to get the treatment they need and the preventative measures beforehand to not pass it on, we wouldn't have to necessarily be the capital in that at all. It's easy to remedy those two. So we treat STDs, they're curable with antibiotics, antifungal drugs, antiprotozoan drugs. Two characteristics of STDs make them nearly impossible to completely eradicate though. So they're curable, but we don't think that we're going to 100% get rid of them ever, even though they are so easy to get rid of. And that's for, number one, their symptoms may be mild or completely absent at times, causing people to not even know that they need to go get treatment, and then they just unwittingly pass that on to other people. And then number two, to prevent reinfection, both partners must be treated simultaneously. So that's why we probably won't eradicate it, as those two reasons, but it's easily treatable, and unfortunately screening for these things should be more routine and easily accessible than they are. I know Planned Parenthood screens a lot of people for this, but a lot of people don't necessarily have the healthcare resources to go to a gynecologist or their primary doctor and get screened all the time for this. The treatment of STDs represents one of the most pressing public issues in the world today. We could also put Zika virus on this list as an STD. We'll talk about that at the end of this lecture. STDs are caused by a variety of organisms that are microbes, and it affects more than 300 million people each year. On to archaea. Archaea exploits some of the most extreme habitats. I've talked about that before. When you look at the photograph of archaea shown here, you may find it hard to believe that they're even a little bit different from bacteria, let alone profoundly different. So they kind of look like bacteria, but actually they're very, very different from bacteria. Archaea, though, like bacteria, do live as single cells or colonies of cells. Both are surrounded by a plasma membrane. Both have species that have flagella, those like whip-like things that help them move. And in fact, it was until the 1970s that biologists considered archaea to be bacteria. They were categorized together before 1970s. It was only when we got DNA technologies that we could do comparisons of the DNA, and that revealed that archaea are as different from bacteria as humans are. So archaea evolutionarily are actually more closely related to eukarya domain than to the bacteria domain. But they're placed in between the bacteria and the eukaryotes on the tree of life. I'm just saying they're slightly closer to eukaryotes, but they're their own distinctive thing in between the two. Archaea and bacteria may look similar, but they have significant differences in their DNA. Furthermore, neither archaea nor bacteria resemble eukarya in one way. So there's one similarity between the archaea and the bacteria that the eukarya don't have, and that is that they're both prokaryotes. In contrast, only eukarya have the cell nucleus and organelles. Archaea thrive in these extreme environments, so we call them extremophiles. They are famous for their ability to live in places where life would seem to be impossible, such as water of 100 degrees Celsius, so boiling water or higher heat. It's really remarkable, and we think that if we find life on other planets like Mars, they're probably going to be more like archaea than bacteria or eukarya. So go ahead and answer this question of which characteristic distinguishes archaeas from bacteria, and pause it if you need to. The answer is number 3. Number 1 isn't true because neither of them have a nucleus. Number 2 isn't true because both of them can have a flagellum. Number 4 isn't true because neither of them have a nuclear membrane because they don't have a nucleus. Number 5 isn't true because they both have a plasma membrane. So number 3 is the answer. Alright, because archaea are extremophiles, they can be really hard to study. It's hard to get into those extreme environments and reproduce those extreme environments in the lab. So there's a lot of species of archaea that I'm sure remain discovered. Just as a small note, we keep generalizing archaea as extremophiles, but there are some that do live in moderate conditions. There's even some in your intestine. But they're distinguishable because of their extremophile members. Okay, now we move on lastly to the domain Eukarya. Protists, there's 4 kingdoms in Eukarya. There's Animalia, which are animals, Plantae, which are plants, Fungi, which is the fungus, and 4th is Protists, which you've probably never heard of. It's kind of a weird grab bag category, but most Protists are single-celled, like the vast majority are single-celled. Here is a diatom being shown. It's a single-celled photosynthetic algae. It's an important part of plankton. So plankton is actually a conglomerate of different microbes, including diatoms. Diatoms are very beautiful and interesting because they have these mineralized cell walls that you can see here, and they provide protection and support. The first eukaryotes, so the first organisms in the domain Eukarya, were protists. We found ancient fossilized eukaryotes that we call archaearchs. So for the first 2 billion years, bacteria and archaea dominated the Earth. But then in rocks about 1.9 billion years old, we find fossils of new kinds of organisms that are 10 times larger than the bacteria and archaea. These are a group of organisms called archaearchs, a name that can be translated as confusing old things. They were the first eukaryotes, so about 1.9 million year old fossils of organisms that are larger than the bacteria and the archaea, and that we also start seeing a nucleus in. That would be the first eukaryotes. Okay, and the most important part of that was the cellular organelles. So yes, they have a larger size. That's one thing that scientists noticed about these fossilized cells. The internal changes in the cells are even more important because they're the basis for the success of the entire eukaryote lineage, including humans. For the first time in the history of life, cells had internal structures that carried out specific functions. Those structures are called organelles, and the specialized activities that the organelles perform make eukaryote cells more complex than prokaryotes. So for the first 2 billion years of life on this planet, everything was a prokaryote. Eventually, eukaryotes evolved. So we have one eukaryotic ancestor, one single-celled ancestor of all eukaryotes. Then we see all of these adaptations, evolutions, mutations. That's why understanding evolution is so important. Result in this range of different species over the next 2 billion years. Which organelle likely evolved first in ancient protists or archaearchs? Yes, the answer is number 3. So 1 through 5 are all organelles. Eukaryotes have organelles, but the oldest eukaryotes we see, and the most distinctive thing for the eukaryotes is that development of a nucleus that contains the DNA. The nucleus is an evolutionary innovation that appeared for the first time in protists. The nucleus is a region inside the cell that is enclosed in its own plasma membrane. Eukaryotes are defined by the presence of this nucleus. These earliest protists then took in bacterial cells that subsequently became specialized as the mitochondria and or the chloroplasts. Remember that endosymbiosis theory? It's all coming back. Remember how I said that Protists are kind of a grab bag. They're diverse and hard to characterize. So we kind of group them as animal-like, fungi-like, or plant-like. So again, the 4 kingdoms under the domain eukarya are plants, fungus, animals, and then protists. And then within protists, we can't really characterize them very well, so we kind of say they're like the other 3. So some protists, like Trichomonas vaginalis, which causes a STD, by the way. Anyway, they're shown here moving around and hunting for prey like an animal. So remember some of those defining features of animals we talked about. Fungi like protists, such as the slime mold shown here, live as heterotrophs, and they form colonies of cells like a fungus. So remember what those fungus characteristics are that we talked about. And then the plant-like protists. They can carry out photosynthesis. So remember some of those characteristics we talked about. Alright, so like animals, the animal-like protists can move. They appear to eat other things. They can run around. An example of this would be the paramecium. An example of a plant-like protist would be the diatoms that I already talked about. They live in ponds, lakes, rivers, oceans. They're small. They're so small that if we took 30 of them next to each other, they would be the width across of a human hair. The characteristic of the diatoms is that they're enclosed in a shell made of silica. Many species of diatoms float in the water, forming part of the phytoplankton. And phytoplankton is a collection of microscopic organisms that undergo photosynthesis. And I'm not going to talk about the fungi-like ones because they're just confusing. Anyway, protists are unicellular, they're diverse, they're hard to categorize, but we can categorize them as animal-like, fungus-like, or plant-like. Protists are an important thing to know about because there's a lot of parasites in the category protists. A parasite is near and dear to my heart because that's what I research. So a parasite is an organism that lives in or on an organism called a host, and it damages it. So a parasitic relationship benefits the parasite but is detrimental to the host harboring the parasite. For example, an example of a parasitic protist is Plasmodium. Plasmodium is transmitted by a mosquito and it's responsible for a worldwide epidemic disease known as malaria. Malaria, which translates as bad air, occurs in tropical parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and it's common in Eastern Mediterranean as well. It's called bad air because malaria is actually really, really old. So this is a disease that was around in the time of the Romans, and they were running around conquering everybody, including parts of Africa and the Mediterranean and Asia, like all over the place. And they thought that malaria was giving the soldiers like this disease because of the air. Like they thought the soldiers were breathing bad air in these areas. This is way back then, when hundreds of years before I understood how diseases were passed from person to person. They used to think the same thing about plague too. So have you ever seen those old-timey cartoons or black and white pictures of a doctor in plague times wearing that really long-nosed mask thing? That's because they believed that there was like healthy air in the mask that the doctor could keep breathing because he didn't want to take it off and breathe the air around because they thought everything was passed by the air. Last example, because it's cool, and then I'll go on, sorry. But when people say you're going to catch a cold, that's another example. Like you don't literally have cold air coming into you and it gets you sick. It's just a time of year that people tend to be around more people because we're not going outdoors as much and we pass viruses like the cold virus or influenza virus from person to person. It's not the air itself doing anything. It's always these microscopic organisms doing these things, causing these diseases that people didn't used to know existed because they couldn't see them. Malaria is important because between 350 million and 500 million people have clinical cases of malaria. That's about 1 million people that die of it each year. Its largest effect is on pregnant women and small children. It's the leading cause of death for children under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. An African child dies of malaria about every 30 seconds. I did a little bit of research on malaria, so I want to talk to you about it as an example of a protease that is also a parasite. The human immune system, remember your immune system's job is to go around and fight stuff. It's supposed to prevent things like this. Your immune system has a difficult time fighting malarial infection because in order to survive from one generation to the next, a Plasmodium parasite goes through a series of developmental stages, meaning that it changes from one form to another, kind of like how we have a stage as infants and we have a stage as adults. And as they go from stage to stage, they produce different cell surfaces, and your immune system recognizes what's bad or not by seeing the surface of things and then eating it. And if it keeps changing its surface, then the immune system has trouble finding it. So Plasmodium stays ahead of the human immune system by constantly changing the way it appears. A lot of parasites do that, actually. Although the immune system doesn't usually have much success fighting malarial infections, some individuals produce red blood cells that are not hospitable to the Plasmodium parasite. So what Plasmodia does is it gets into your bloodstream through the bite of a fly, feeding on blood. So a mosquito will feed on an infected person, it'll suck up that infected blood, it'll go feed on an uninfected person, and while it's drinking uninfected blood, it pushes back some infected blood into the bloodstream. The malaria parasites then go into the red blood cells of that new host, and it lives in there and it goes through all these developmental stages inside the red blood cell. But not all red blood cells are make happy homes for malaria. If we talk about individuals carrying sickle cell trait, remember sickle cell is a variant on, it's a mutated hemoglobin protein that is in red blood cells. And if hemoglobin is mutated, it will stick together, forming long chains that distort the shape of the red blood cell, giving it a sickle shape instead of that nice round disc shape. The sickled red blood cells are inhospitable to Plasmodium because they are not the right shape and all sorts of other reasons. Although carrying a copy of this mutated hemoglobin allele confers resistance to malaria, so it can be a good thing if you're a heterozygote, that means you're a carrier of sickle cell trait. But if you're homozygous recessive, meaning you carry 2 copies of the mutated hemoglobin allele, then you have sickle cell anemia, and that's not good. That's a severe genetic disease that is more debilitating than malaria. So it's kind of a trade-off. These are other parasitic protozoa that I wanted to show you. So my research is always focused on Leishmania, shown here on the left. So Leishmania has 2 different stages. There's this, it's transmitted by a sandfly, which is kind of like a tiny mosquito. And in the sandfly gut, it swims around. You can see it there. They're single-celled, they have flagellum, they're swimming around in the gut of the sandfly. And the sandfly then goes and feeds on a person, and those parasites get into the bloodstream. They then live inside of macrophages, which are immune cells that should eat them, but Leishmania is really smart, and it makes those macrophages its home instead of getting digested by them. And it forms these tiny little balls, and there's dozens and dozens of them within a single macrophage. Leishmania has a lot of different species, and they cause different types of leishmaniasis. It could be deadly if these Leishmania get into your internal organs. It could cause what we call mucocutaneous form that eats away your nasopharyngeal tract, so the mucous membranes in your face and nose and throat, it eats them away. It's really disfiguring. Or it could just be localized at the site of the sandfly bite, and it doesn't really spread anywhere else. Other single-celled parasitic protozoa include Trypanosoma brucei, which causes sleeping sickness in Africa, you may have heard of. It's also found in cows as well as people. And then Giardia lamblia, a single-celled proteist, and is a major cause of diarrhea. So when you go to other countries and you drink the water, if you get severe diarrhea, I think it's called traveler's diarrhea or something like that, it's probably being caused by this parasite. Okay, so some proteists can have cause some very debilitating diseases. Last, I want to talk about viruses. Viruses are very unique. They are at the border between living and non-living. Here you can see several viruses on the surface of a single cell. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The first virus that we ever could see when we got the really high-tech microscopes that we could see something as small as a virus were bacteriophage viruses, and they look like this. They almost look like crazy alien ships landing on a cell. Very interesting structures. But viruses don't just look like that. They come in all different shapes. But what they all have in common is that they have a container, which is called a capsid. That capsid is made of proteins, and its job is to hold all of the genetic material. Sometimes there is a membrane called an envelope around that capsid. I don't really care if you know about that. You just need to know they all have a capsid, and they all have genetic material. So living organisms, all the genetic material is DNA, and then that DNA becomes RNA, becomes protein. But in the case of viruses, their genetic material can be DNA or RNA, which is weird. A virus particle does not carry out any metabolic processes. Okay, that's a huge reason why they're not considered living. They can't do anything. They can't control the inward or outward movement of molecules to make the conditions inside the virus particle different from conditions outside, like all the other cells can. All they will do is wait for a chance to insert that genetic material into a living cell. Once they insert that genetic material, the host cell that it's infected, is going to replicate the genetic material for it and repackage and produce more viruses. So viruses don't even replicate their own genetic material. They don't even make their own proteins. All they are is genetic material wrapped up in a package of proteins that get into a host cell and totally take over it to do its bidding. Because they're dependent on that host metabolic machinery for replication, the viruses are not considered living. Go ahead and answer this question. The answer is all of the above. So a virus is not a cell, so number 3 is not true. Number 2, they do not carry out any metabolic processes. They rely on the host to do that. Number 1, they cannot replicate on their own. They can't. So a cell can always split into 2 cells, but viruses aren't cells and they can't replicate themselves. Viruses are responsible for many health problems. Some viral diseases, such as the common cold, are not usually serious, but others have been responsible for worldwide epidemics called pandemics. The influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1919 killed at least 20 million people, as possibly as many as 50 million. The current AIDS epidemic is caused by a virus, and it has infected nearly 40 million people with an annual mortality of about 3 million. Another virus that you've probably heard a lot about, so I want to talk about, is Zika virus. I got these following slides from the CDC's website. They've done research and put together some information for the public about Zika virus to inform us. So just to let you know what it is, it's a virus, and it's spread from person to person through a mosquito. There's different species of mosquitoes. They all look the same to you probably, but if you look at them real close, there's different species. And there's only certain species of mosquito that can carry the Zika virus. Many people won't have symptoms or will only have mild symptoms if they're infected, which is not good because then we can't really know who to treat or not. Infection during pregnancy can cause microcephaly and other severe brain defects in the developing fetus. So that's where it becomes really problematic. The historical background on Zika is that Zika virus was first discovered in a monkey in the Zika forest of Uganda in 1947. So it got its name from that Zika forest in Uganda in 1947. So we've known about it for a long time. It just hasn't caused a lot of issues until now. A large reason for that is because of climate change. The warm parts of the earth are expanding, so these mosquitoes that can carry Zika are found in more places, in different places than they used to be able to live. So you can find these mosquitoes in Florida, and they didn't used to necessarily be able to live there. Anyway, before 2007, at least 14 cases of Zika had been documented, although other cases were likely to have occurred and were not reported. Zika outbreaks have probably occurred in many locations. Because the symptoms of Zika are similar to those of many other diseases, many cases may not have been recognized in the past. On January 22, 2016, CDC activated its Emergency Operations Center to respond to outbreaks of Zika occurring in the Americas, mostly South America, and increased reports of birth defects and Guillain-Barré syndrome, we'll talk about what that is, in areas affected by Zika. On February 8, 2016, CDC elevated its Emergency Operations Center activation to a level 1, which is the highest level. On February 1st, 2016, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern because of clusters of microcephaly and other neurological disorders in some areas affected by Zika. Again, it's spread through mosquitoes. That's the primary spread to people, is through the bite of an infected mosquito. A pregnant woman that's infected can then pass Zika virus to her fetus during pregnancy or around the time of birth. This is considered an STD technically because a person infected with Zika virus can pass it to his or her sex partner. We know that Zika is found in... So if you have Zika virus and you're a man, you can go and you can get that cleared up. But we're going to find Zika virus levels in your blood are going to disappear before levels in your semen even. So you could test positive for Zika in your semen before it's still in your bloodstream. So it can definitely be spread sexually from males to their pregnant partners. Zika virus may be spread through blood transfusions as well. There have been no documented cases of transmission through breast milk. So one of the things people keep asking about is, should I not breastfeed if I potentially have Zika? And the official answer to that by doctors is that the benefits of breastfeeding outweigh theoretical risk of Zika virus transmission through breast milk. Anyone who lives in or travels to an area with Zika and has not already been infected with Zika virus can get it. The symptoms are similar to other illnesses that spread through mosquito bites, so it's kind of hard to diagnose. Many people will not have symptoms or only have mild symptoms. Symptoms last several days to a week. People don't usually get sick enough to go to the hospital, and they very, very, very rarely die from Zika. The symptoms are fever, rash, joint pain, conjunctivitis, which means red eyes. So it doesn't really kill people or even hurt that much. The biggest concern is when it comes to pregnant women. We expect that women who develop Zika will have similar illness to people who are not pregnant. No evidence exists to suggest that pregnant women are more susceptible to experience more severe disease during pregnancy. Okay, so pregnant women are pretty much okay too. The problem is when we get to the developing fetus. We don't know if pregnant women are more likely to develop symptoms compared to the general population. But we do know they can pass it on to their offspring, their developing offspring. The biggest concern with those offspring is microcephaly, which is a severe brain defect, very, very severe. It's a defect in which a baby's head is smaller than expected, and when compared to babies of the same sex and age. So a baby's brain pretty much doesn't develop properly. We don't know if a newborn who gets Zika at birth will develop microcephaly after birth, which is called acquired microcephaly. That's something they're still researching. There is no evidence to suggest that past Zika virus infection will have a risk of birth defects for future pregnancies once it has cleared a woman's body. It's also been linked to other problems in fetuses, like miscarriage, stillbirth, poorly developed brain structures, eye defect, limb abnormalities. Lastly, Zika is linked with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which you've probably never heard of. I hadn't heard of it. It's an uncommon sickness of the nervous system. in which a person's own immune system damages the nerve cells. So your own immune system is attacking your own nerve cells. And this can cause muscle weakness and even paralysis. It's strongly associated with Zika, but only a small percentage of people with Zika infection get it. So they're still trying to research the link between this syndrome and Zika. That's the last slide. Next week we will be covering ecology. The week after that will be plants. And then the last, 2 weeks will be over the human body. Have a good day.